The first step is going to be to create an Alexa skill. So head over to developer.amazon.com, and then once you're in the page, you can click on sign in at the top. And then here you're just basically going to sign in with your Amazon account. Once you sign in, you can click on Alexa at the top left corner, and then create an Alexa skill. And finally, console. So this is the Alexa developer console, and that's where you can manage all of your skills. So let's click on create skill. And the first thing is to define a name for it. And in my case, I'm gonna define as deployment manager. So I'm gonna call deployment manager. The next thing is the default language. With the default language, you just need to make sure that your Alexa device is configured to use the same language as your skill that you define here. For example, in my case, I'm using English Canada, so I just need to make sure that my Alexa device is configured to use English Canada. If my skill was English Canada and my Alexa device was English UK, then my skill would not necessarily be available. However, if you want your skill to be available for multiple languages, you can just add multiple languages to your skill later on. So I'm just gonna leave as is. So I'm gonna use English Canada. Then after that, we need to choose the model to add to the skill. We have a couple of models. We have custom, flash briefing, smart home, and video, but none of these apply to our solution. The flash briefing is for news, smart home is to control lights, the sort of things, and for video, it contains or supports content search and also suggestions. And because we're gonna do something completely different, I'm gonna make sure that custom is selected. Then the next thing is how we're gonna host the backend resources. We have three options: Alexa hosted, Node.js, and Python, or provision your own. If you use the Alexa hosted, that means you need to develop your function either in Node.js or Python, as it says here. And another thing to bear in mind is that the resources are gonna be deployed to your AWS account up to the AWS free tier limit. And as you can see here, it says you gain access to an AWS Lambda endpoint, 5 GB of media storage, and 15 GB of monthly data transfer, and a table for session persistence. And because I want to have total control of my backend resources, I'm gonna select provision your own. But the Alexa hosted in Node.js and Python is perfect if you're getting started with it. But if you'd like to develop your Lambda function in another language, like for example Java or Golang, then you would have to provision your own. Now after this, we're ready to move on to the next step, so we can click on create skill. And then the next step is gonna be the template that we're gonna add to the skill. And here we have different types of template. And again, I wanna start from scratch. So I'm just gonna go with Hello World skill. So this one is selected. And then I'm gonna click on choose. Now it's gonna take a couple of seconds because it's building the voice model. And there it is. So our skill has been created. Now it's time for us to define a few things. Let's start with the invocation name. The invocation name is basically what you're gonna say to Alexa to start interacting with your application. In my case, my Alexa skill is called Deployment Manager, so I'm gonna make Deployment Manager as the invocation name. Once I configure everything, I would be able to say to Alexa, Alexa, ask Deployment Manager to do something. So in this case, Deployment Manager is the invocation name, and that's how I'm gonna interact with my application. So right here where it says change me, I'm gonna put Deployment Manager. And here just make sure that everything is lowercase, because if I put uppercase, it's gonna say that the invocation name cannot contain uppercase characters. So make sure it's lowercase. Once you define it, you can just save the model. That was the first thing. Now the second thing is something that we call intent. To define the intent, here on the left you have interaction model, and then you've got intents. You see that if you selected the Hello World skill template, you're gonna have 6 intents. 5 of them, they're gonna start with Amazon, all uppercase, and these are the intents which are managed by Amazon, and some of them are actually required. So let me just close this first so you can see. And if you think about intents in the code, intent is basically a function in your code. So you've got your Lambda function, and then within that function, you're gonna define multiple functions, and each one of them is gonna map to an intent here. Now, what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna start by deleting the first one, which is the hello world intent. I'm gonna create my own, so let me just click on delete. Now, to create your own intent, you just click on add intent. And the first thing is the name of the intent. Before I define a name, let's understand better what an intent is. So an intent is basically what you're trying to accomplish. If you're thinking about CI/CD and what we're trying to accomplish here, we can do a few things. The main thing that we're going to be focused on the series is to deploy a website. But you could deploy a website, you could roll back a website to the previous version, you could also build a website. So all of these actions in what you're trying to accomplish, that's going to be an intent. So in this example that I gave you, the deploy would be an intent, rollback would be an intent, and build could be another intent. So let me define deploy, because that's the one that we're going to be focusing on the series. So I'm going to call deploy intent, and then we can click on create custom intent. Now, once you define your intent, once you create intent, you need to define utterances. Utterances is basically what the user says. So if I say to my Alexa device, Alexa, ask deployment manager to deploy the website to, let's say, production or to staging. So deploy website to production, deploy website to staging. These are the utterances. And here, the more utterances you define, the better, because then Alexa is going to be able to understand you more naturally. So instead of just typing in deploy website to a certain environment, I could say deploy website, deploy landing page, deploy single application page. So we can define different utterances here. Let me start by defining two of them. So the first one is going to be deploy website to production. Then I'm also gonna want to deploy to staging, because here we're gonna have two environments, production and staging. So I'm gonna say deploy website to staging. But imagine that we have three types of sentences and we have two environments, which means that we're gonna have to define 6 sentences in total, 3 for production and 3 for staging. So to reduce the amount of utterances, we can turn staging and production into a variable called environment. And then when you say staging or production, Alexa is gonna use that value in your sentence. And what we're talking here is something called slot. So before I define all the utterances, let's take a look at slot and create a slot. On the left-hand side, you've got slot types. So click on slot type and then add a slot type. Now you need to define a name. So we're gonna define as environment. And here are all the values for your environment. So if you have production, you have staging, QA, dev, you would define everything here. In my case, I only have production and staging. So I'm gonna write production, staging, and then like I said, you could define more values if you wanted. Now, before I go back to intents, let's make sure that I save this model. Now let's go back to intent, click on deploy intent. Before we can use the slot that we created, we actually need to create it down here first. So we need to declare the slot. So I'm going to call it environment. I'm going to click on the plus sign and then on the slot type. And you see we have custom here, which is the one that we defined. And you have built-in slot types, which are the ones that Amazon defined. So you've got a lot of them actually here. So I'm gonna click on environment, which is the one that I created. And then you have multi-value, which means that can you use multiple environments in our case? So can you say deploy my website to production and staging, or would you like to deploy to a single environment at a time? I'm gonna go with single environment at a time. So I'm gonna specify no for multi-value. Once we define the slot, we can go back to utterances and we can type in deploy website to, and then we can use curly brackets. And you see that your slot's gonna show up there. So click on environment, enter. So now instead of having deploy website to staging and deploy website to production, I can simply have deploy website to and then the environment. which means that I can delete staging and production. And just to make sure that I can say different things, I'm gonna find two more utterances. So deploy landing page to environment and deploy single application page to environment. And like I said, the more you specify here, the better. Once we're done with intents, we can again save the model. And that's pretty much what we need to do right now to have a very simple Alexa skill. So we define the invocation name, we define an intent for deploying the website, and if you wanted to have an intent to roll back the website, to build a website, you could create two more intents. But for this series, we're gonna create just one. We define 3 utterances, which is the user expression, so what the user is gonna say to Alexa. And then for each one of the utterances, we define a slot, which can, in our case, can be either staging or production. The next step in our Alexa skill that we need to configure would be the endpoint. And the service endpoint type, you can see that you can either specify a Lambda function, so a Lambda ARN, or if you have your own HTTPS website, you could specify it here as well. But for this solution, we're gonna go with Lambda. I still don't have my Lambda created, and which is what we're gonna be doing in the next video. And as soon as we create it, we're gonna come back here and configure our Lambda endpoint.